couple weeks ago, I was giving a talk off-site about some Catholic thing, and then there was a break. And during the break, someone came up and they were very complimentary. I really like the talk, Father. Could you share with me your vocation story? And it's a fair question, so I had to tell her something. But I have to admit, I wasn't really chomping at the bit to tell my vocation story. Partially because of the circumstances. It's hard to share your vocation story in like 5 or 10 minutes, but also because I find a lot of times when it comes to vocation stories, especially involving the priesthood, there's a certain unspoken expectation based on certain conventions associated with the genre of vocation stories. So, to use an analogy, say you're watching a romantic comedy, and throughout the course of the hour and a half or 2 hours, there's like tension building between the two leads, and at the end, they don't kiss. You'll be upset, and rightly so, right? They're violating certain conventions associated with the genre. So ideally, they kiss, they confess their love for each other, ideally it's in the rain. So I think a similar thing applies when it comes to vocation stories involving the priesthood, right? So whether people acknowledge it or not, there's a certain expectation that the story is going to be built around a certain moment. There's a certain moment where God speaks to your heart and calls you to the priesthood, calls you to this as opposed to that, be this as opposed to that. And my story is not like that. And so when I think about it, my story certainly includes certain moments, inspirations in prayer, certain influential encounters with people, influential circumstances. But at the same time, when I break it down, my vocation story is relatively simple and almost kind of boring, actually. So back in the day, when I was in grade 9, I first felt the beginnings of the tugging of the heartstrings, this idea of being a priest. If you were a priest, imagine the peace you would feel in your heart. Apparently, I'm not alone in that. Apparently, a lot of young men who eventually become priests, they start feeling the call to the holy priesthood around that age, around grade 9. The only difficulty was that I didn't know my faith, and I wasn't practicing my faith. I had to deal with those things one at a time. So in terms of knowledge, I did this little interesting thing. I just started reading books. Not books about incidental things, like spiritual warfare or even discernment. I started reading the Catechism of the Holy Catholic Church. Basic foundational principles with regards to this is right, this is wrong, this is true, and this is false. And also, I started practicing my faith. Started praying, holy hour, 60 minutes before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. Not to mention frequenting sacraments, going to confession once a week, once every 2 weeks, going to Mass every single day, seeing a spiritual director, an elderly priest like once a month. And before you know it, I applied to seminary, and before you know it, here we are today. So you hear that story, again, simple, straightforward, kind of boring. But the reason why I bring it up is because it goes to our notion as to what vocation is all about, right? To give you an example, just to kind of frame the issue, I remember a long time ago when I was in the seminary, I was talking to a fellow classmate, someone who was also studying for the Holy Priesthood, and he was lamenting the fact that a lot of our fellow classmates looked at vocation in terms of a fixed deadline. And so he said, how guys typically look at our time in the seminary is like, look, 5 years till I get ordained, 4 years till I get ordained, 3 years, 2, and 1. He's like, that's how people look at jail. And it makes you wonder, right? One day I'll discover my vocation. In the meantime, I'm just, biding my time. I'm in a holding pattern. Or let's say you discover your vocation. Let's say you discover your vocation, then what? I'm just waiting to die? There's more to it than that, right? Regardless of what your vocation might be, you need to look at it not so much as a static thing or a fixed moment in your timeline. It's meant to be living and active. It's meant to lead you to grow and change and transform over a long period of time, over the course of your life. That's why I would suggest the proper way to look at your vocation. Your vocation is simply a deepening of who you already are and who the Lord is calling you to be. Now, with that in mind, I want to share with you 2 stories. So back in the day when I was in the seminary, there's this year called the internship year, where you're not a priest, you're not a deacon, you're just a guy in the seminary, but you're in a parish. And so you're journeying with the holy people of God, you're journeying with the pastor. So at a certain point, I was just telling him about all these things I didn't like about myself, and being brutally honest in that regard. I was telling him all these things I didn't like about myself, all these reasons why I didn't think I should get ordained as a priest. And it wasn't simply a matter of like sin, right? If it was a matter of that, that would be pretty straightforward. It wasn't so much like, here are my sins, I'm looking for absolution. It's like, here are ways that I look at myself, identity issues, things I'm grappling with, things that I'm struggling with, And based on that, this is how I think God sees me. What saith you? And I remember as I was pouring out my heart, he was really calm, almost annoyingly so. And I called him out on that. It's like, are you even paying attention? Like, you look so calm. And he was like, I don't know, I guess I just trust in God. I guess I just trust in God. I've also had time to think about that particular conversation, and I would suggest that he was alluding to a couple key principles when it comes to Pauline theology. First of all, this notion that where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. It's really important for us to remember that passage and pray into it often. You don't have to look at life with rose-colored glasses. You can look at the messiness in the world. You can look at the messiness within yourself and not be afraid, because where sin abounds, and it does abound, grace abounds all the more. Now, the corresponding point is nothing can separate you from the love of Christ. A lot of times we think this thing, like, gosh, until I become, someone, something, God will always be distant. But in reality, nothing can separate you from the love of Christ. Christ is the hound of heaven. He's constantly pursuing you. He's constantly repairing your broken vessel, working through your brokenness, working through your frailty, and he will not be defeated. The Holy Spirit is not some distant entity out there in heaven. He is struggling to emerge victorious in the midst of your messy, broken, and vulnerable life. And the point is, if you have clarity about both those points, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more, and nothing can separate you from the love of Christ, you should not be worried. You should not be afraid. And you should not fret, because you have deep trust in God. So a long time ago, when I was still in my early 20s, my dad died of liver cancer. We were waiting for him to get a liver transplant, and then all of a sudden the transplant came. But they opened him up and they realized that the cancer had spread too far. And so they closed him up. And so he had 1-2 days. I remember going to my father's bedside, and I knew he was going to die tomorrow. And so just put yourself in a situation, what do you say? How do you say it? And so I just dug deep, and I just wanted to make sure my heart was empty. And so I said a whole bunch of things. It was this constant stream of words. And to this day, I don't remember a single thing that I said. But I remember his reaction. And so he was in so much pain, he couldn't even open his eyes. But he said, "Very good, Rick." I think he called me Rick. "Very good, Rick. I heard everything. That was very good." Shades of the book of Genesis, right? The Creator God, he creates these things out of the abundance of the love which is in his heart. Birds of the air, fish of the sea, whenever he creates these things, which are meant to be reflections of his beauty and his majesty, he says it is good. And then he creates Adam, who is meant to be an image of himself. And he says, it is very good. So you put it all together, here's my father, and he's basically saying to me, look, I'm very happy with you. I'm pleased with what you're doing. I'm pleased with the man that you've become. And I rejoice in your presence, because I'm your father and because you're my son. It took me a while to realize this, but I think us having that conversation, that healed a deep wound in my heart that I didn't know even existed until it was healed, because we all long for that. You got to realize it wasn't just some guy, it was my father. And our fathers are meant to embody to us in a particular way the love of God the Father for us. And we always wonder that, gosh, is God happy with me? Is God pleased with me? Does God actually rejoice in my presence? And God bless my dad, he just recognized the moment. This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased. You are my beloved son, and I am very pleased. We all need to hear that. We all need to live out of this space, and that was the gift of my father to me. Now, when I tell you these two stories, let's say I frame it in terms of my vocation story. You might think, well, gosh, like, what does that have to do with anything? Not once do you mention priesthood. You don't even mention the word discernment. And so all that would seem to be incidental. If you look at your vocation in terms of discovering that moment where God calls you to this as opposed to that, yeah, all that seems irrelevant. But when you do that, and here's the point, you miss the best parts of life. Because constantly, every single day, throughout the course of your life, the Lord is calling you to grow and to stretch and to change and to transform. And that's your vocation. The deepening of who you already are and who the Lord is calling you to be.